Vault-Tec and the Enclave are always at the center of known experiments across Fallout's world. But what about other parties performing bizarre research before the bombs fell? I'm Mark from Digital Dissection. I make Fallout lore videos, and today I'll be your guide to experimentation long before Fallout's modern age. When experiments are mentioned in Fallout, it's easy to look towards forced evolutionary virus and the numerous pursuits of Vault-Tec. When taking a closer examination of what society was doing outside of Project Safehouse and the Pan-Immunity Virion project, there are actually some troubling and hidden developments that occurred behind the scenes. As it turns out, there seems to be very few angels within the research and development realm of Fallout's old world. And it seems no matter what industry or focus advancements in medicine and technology had, casualties and nefarious individuals were always around every corner. We don't exactly need a bevy of excuses to hate Fallout's former US government. After all, they were the Enclave in disguise long before the old world ended. But it turns out even they had some lesser-known experiments that they actually subjected the American people to. Hidden within former Pentagon computer terminals in the Citadel in 2277, multiple entries can be found detailing activities being used to experiment on the US populace. One such experiment was called Project Brainstorm, which was a portion of a larger operation that was called the Induced Patriotism Initiative, which, if you break down the words alone, is a way to influence the US population through subliminal messaging. The terminal entry goes on to detail. Brainstorm Military, Cultural Center 2076 Progress Report. Our flagship project, the Induced Patriotism Initiative, has met with resounding success. Our agents have successfully included covert and overt messages of extreme patriotism and loyalty into popular media ranging from the big screen to the Sunday funnies. Increased military enrollment amongst target demographics serves to underline this success. So it isn't entirely clear exactly the fullest extent of the project's scope just based on this information alone. However, we can infer that it's possible to extend to various posters seen across all of Fallout's wasteland, and likely any newspapers and pre-war media you might discover in your travels. How long the Induced Patriotism Initiative went on for isn't exactly clear, but based on communist paranoia sweeping across Fallout's old world, it's likely to have been around at least during the timeline of the Sino-American War's latter years. What we also know from this terminal entry, however, is that additional media types also saw subliminal messaging influence, as this also extended into popular music. Agent Webb has been particularly effective at influencing the music industry, and he has interesting proposals for the fields of organized sports and even such notoriously difficult markets as comic books and toys. A success in these areas would ensure early education with our message, and thus ensure a more dedicated and devoted nation for us all. So it would seem that the US government was already running experiments across a very wide population of the United States long before anyone ever entered a vault. And the unknowing citizens of the population were seeing this rhetoric in everything they did in their normal everyday lives. As it turns out, however, this was not the only pre-war experiment we know that the government was involved with. Naturally, the government couldn't just be trying to influence its citizens through subliminal messaging. They'd also be randomly investigating ways to damage its enemies' infrastructure. That is, with animals. Yes, the United States government during this same time period sought to develop a program utilizing an unknown rodent species to infiltrate foreign nations and use them to damage its enemies' positions. A development effort titled Mission Cloacina sought to enlist the aid of bioengineered animals to get the job done. Development of the mutant undermining life form continues apace, and our chief bioengineers are certain that they will be able to perfect these living weapons in time for deployment with Red China. Once covertly released into an enemy's environment, their aggressive qualities, dangerous hunger, and pervasive breeding should severely undermine the infrastructure of the location in short order, softening the target for ground invasion, At this point, the genetic kill switch can be activated, allowing for easy reclamation, not including a significant one-time cleanup effort. Current MUL development primarily uses genetic stock of rodents, particularly the common sewer rat, and progress has been significant. FEV testing has been rejected, however, as the results are sterile. While we already know that the government and FEV research was already ongoing in the years leading up to the Great War, evidence of rodent experimentation doesn't appear outside of this terminal entry. What we're assuming, however, is that these research efforts likely graduated from the sewer rat population and potentially extended into mole rats. It would make sense too, given their ability to form burrows and potentially be unleashed to dig beneath enemy territory in a similar fashion. What might add further evidence to the belief that they were a likely research specimen is that Vault 81's science team also used mole rats to explore infectious diseases, and these mole rats escaped containment to further expand into a secret colony. Oddly enough, Mission Cloacina has real-world equals in the history of animals being used in warfare, as bats were once utilized by the US military in what was called Project X-Ray. The plan involved equipping bats with napalm charges, which would then in theory be used to attack Japan during World War II. A prototype bomb would contain over 1,000 compartments for hibernating Mexican free-tailed bats, which would deploy and drop the napalm bombs. The project, however, was met with several delays. While technically considered effective, the project was eventually scrapped in lieu of the atomic bomb. So it seems that Project Cloacina really isn't that crazy of a concept, given that Project X-Ray is just one example of many more historical animal research projects in military applications. Our next experiment takes us to the Charlestown neighborhood of the Boston Commonwealth, where an abandoned house remains within a block of residences that's tucked behind a main road. When I first saw this house many years ago, I thought its long-faded Halloween decorations told a story, but little did I know just how far that story went. Upon arrival, you'll quickly notice that this location features many feral ghouls strewn across the porch of this home, and the reasoning for why will make sense very soon. The ruined home has clearly seen better days, and sports a noticeable infestation of fungus and glowing spores that have grown into its walls and furniture. The ghoul presence outside of the home matches many found within, and on its first floor sits a curious holotape that takes us back to the days of 2077, through the eyes of a woman named Research Assistant Peters. The researcher entered part of a study to investigate radiation exposure, which its operators promised included an experimental serum that would mitigate or remove the radiation's effects. Peters, however, was ordered to administer an exposure of roughly 600 rads via intravenous fluids. The process on February 26, 2077 began slowly and was gradually increased. Peters immediately noticed the impact to her health, which included limb weakness, her gums bleeding, and severe abdominal cramping. She'd go on to detail.
I've never in my life felt as horrible as I do right now. The discomfort is almost too much to bear. I often contemplate termination of this trial, but I know it'll only be a few more days before I reach 6 sieverts. Then I can administer the serum. We'll get our contract renewed. The serum will go to the market, and it's going to help people. It's really going to change the way we live.
Peters would provide an additional update on March 1st, 2077, which chronicled the literal process of what we now know as ghoulification. Aside from contracting a fever, Peters underwent several conditions that should sound quite familiar.
All previous symptoms are still present. Tissue damage visible on arms, neck and hands, necrotic sloughing of the skin. Topical and ingested antibiotics applied to control infection. Now injecting first dose of serum sample 42BA7 into bloodstream. No immediate effects observed.
An important detail to focus on is the supposed serum that Peters was taking from the unknown firm she was doing the research for. Serum sample 42-BA-7 was an injection that Peters was supposed to use to counteract the effects of the 600 rads she had endured. The only problem was that the first dosage she took achieved nothing. despite her knowledge of animal trials having yielded better results. A second dosage of 42-BA-7 also showed no effect, a concerning fact because not only did she already begin to undergo skin and tissue necrosis, her literal teeth also began falling out. According to the protocols, however, for the trial, she was required to maintain a quarantine, despite her toxicity levels continuing to have no improvement. Her concerns would lead her to request a termination of the trial, but these requests were ultimately denied. What the researcher began to quickly realize was that her death was imminent, and with no chance to survive, appealed to a fellow researcher to deliver her final words to her family.
I understand. I'm going to die. That's obvious. It's right here. Our failure. If you would, Dr. Roberts, please deliver the following to my family. Mom, Dad, I love you. Yes, I volunteered for this. It sounds crazy, but I believed in it. There'll be nothing left worth bearing. Just know Oh, no. That's a bit too sentimental. Let me think about it.
The most disturbing aspect of Peter's involvement with the Voluntary Exposure Project is that curing her of the lethal radiation was truly never an option, as she was designed to be a control subject the entire time. The holotapes literally state this, meaning that she was a known sacrifice to the experiment's organizers from the very beginning. Unfortunately, we don't quite know who built out this study, but it's on par for many of the heartless corporations that funded so many other initiatives across Fallout's history. Equally heartbreaking to research assistant Peters, however, is that this home is not just likely her final resting place, but for others potentially involved in the same initiative. There's almost a dozen dead and still living feral ghouls scattered across this abandoned home, and a glowing one is found locked away on its third floor, inside of a larger storage room. So is it possible that Peters is this isolated glowing one, locked inside of a storage room for hundreds of years? It's definitely possible, and other participants in the doomed radiation study may have suffered similar fates. HalluciGEN Inc. may not be familiar to all of Fallout's fans, but it absolutely should be. The pre-war company isn't exactly always known as a staple of the most malevolent organizations across the franchise, but there's plenty of reasons why you shouldn't trust its smoothly designed logo and its building located in the Boston Commonwealth. In Fallout's future, it's a site under contamination lockdown due to dangerous chemicals, but the toxic green gases witnessed here are only a snapshot of the company's mismanagement. HalluciGEN played a role in the ever-degrading societal events that led to the breakdown of the former United States, developing cutting-edge non-lethal technologies that focused on law enforcement and military applications. In 2055, their flagship HalluciGEN gas would see its initial prototypes, eventually being fine-tuned over the next 22 years. A Type 2 fragmentation grenade filled with potent gases designed to neutralize and control rioters. It was one of several proposed solutions HalluciGEN would craft that would hopefully lead to resolving possibly violent scenarios, with de-escalated outcomes. This would further extend to products like the Dispersant, another riot control device that would induce panic and a flight response to expose civilians. HalluciGEN R&D also included the Suppressor, a pacification tool that could paralyze armored targets with electrical discharges. Many of these products were actually developed by the lead engineer of the Mesmetron, a device developed by Implied Hypnotics Incorporated, which could effectively mind control individuals when hit with the energy weapon's blast. Some might remember that growing social unrest and food shortages led to increasingly intense riots within Fallout's old world, and a company like HalluciGEN seemed positioned to greatly be of use for the previously discussed applications. What was truly evil about their mission as a company, however, was how they attempted to achieve it, with widespread human test subjects. Unfortunately, despite touting research and development that would spare human lives, HalluciGEN sacrificed ethics in horrific ways to advance its company vision. What the public didn't exactly know about HalluciGEN was that its offices represented more of a trap to anyone that answered its calls for testers and participants in its studies. Immediately upon entering the building, the administrative team had specific protocols designed to ensure that potential study participants would be apprehended. detailed in the reception area's terminal. Request ID. Cross-check with the day's test schedule. Verbally confirm that the visitor is a test subject, not a client. Offer refreshments. Instruct subjects to fill out intake forms 12-A through 12-H. This should allow sufficient time for the sedatives in the water to take effect. Notify the appropriate lab personnel. When instructed, complete Form 12-I, Dismissal, 12-J, Accident Report, or 12-K, Fatal Accident Report. So there's quite a bit here to break down, as subjects were drugged to ensure their participation in HalluciGEN studies. But from the beginning, the company was aware that test participants were likely to face potentially dangerous and lethal conditions on a consistent basis. Why the company chose to be so inhumane in their procedures is unknown, but it was clear that HalluciGEN's primary concerns were its investors, who routinely visited to observe test subjects and track their progress. Unfortunately for several projects, this came with many routine atrocities, like the initial HalluciGEN gas canister tests. While the product was advertised as a non-violent riot mitigation device, one test scenario found within lab reports actually proved that initial results were anything but. An entry under Test Protocol 59-211-01 detailed the trial of 5 individuals subjected to an early gas canister design. Unfortunately for them, this included 2 major flaws: the canister's deployment method and the concentration of the gas mixture. The canister essentially functioned as a grenade, immediately injuring 2 of the study's participants, while all 5 of those involved became frenzied or confused and increasingly aggressive. The level of aggression was paired with an adrenal gland rupture during the exposure, and part of the frenzied condition caused these test subjects to see hallucinations. What followed was an all-out brawl, where 4 of the subjects died fighting each other, with the final individual dying of heart failure. These kinds of events at HalluciGEN, however, seemed quite common, as observation lab procedures were created specifically to address them when VIPs and investors might have seen a test that didn't go according to plan. For a considerable amount of time, however, blunders would continue in HalluciGEN R&D, which extended to its Eradicator product line, a device meant to decontaminate a large area of all biological and chemical substances. What test subjects had no idea, however, was that the Eradicator was actually a 2-ton machine capable of producing over 5,100 rads, meaning that exposure would guarantee death to the participants. This, of course, was after the subjects would see their skin be completely disintegrated, which happened during an October 21st test in 2077, leading to the deaths of 3 individuals in that particular trial. What's quite clear is that if you observe the test results left behind by the HalluciGEN development team, an emerging story is that its lead engineer from Implied Hypnotics was never qualified to handle the creation of such devices, as his lack of effective designs led to the paralysis of test subjects in other trials, and institutionalizing another after exposure to HalluciGEN's dispersant product. In this case, the impacted individuals suffered a flight response so terrifying they couldn't even recognize their own child who was left in the waiting room, requiring apprehension by local police after the test subject fled the facility. The most terrifying aspect of these events is that these are the only ones that are documented in the building. And I personally think it's safe to assume that there are possibly far more cover-ups, unknown deaths, and impacted persons that we'll never know the full extent of. What's increasingly clear after observing HalluciGEN is that this facility acted more like a prison than anything else, and its treatment of humans is just as evil as Vault-Tec, if not worse. Investigating further will also prove that the company took efforts to mislead their investors, as financial drafts show operating at a $1.8 billion loss versus revenue of only $1.1. And its CEO, Eric Rice, further helped reinforce this deception in its final third-quarter financials report. Our long-term contracts have provided us with a strong financial foundation. In the current global political climate, we expect a tremendous demand for our products in the months and years ahead. From top to bottom, It seems that HalluciGEN was corrupt in every fiber of its being. And no matter who they worked with, whether law enforcement, military personnel, or private entities, their practices were essentially war crimes disguised as product development. Humanity, of course, once again takes the L within the Fallout universe when we examine pre-war research that's not even associated with some of the series' worst aggressors. While some of the projects discussed may seem tame compared to others, there's a level of unease I find when uncovering breakthroughs and technology advancements within Fallout's canon, as the risk of hurting human life always seems to be secondary regardless of who the source is. What might seem scary to consider, however, is that humans have routinely committed similar clinical miscues across our own history. This includes products like the thalidomide drug in the 1950s and 60s, which led to body malformations and infant death. All of this made possible after clinical trials called the sedative safe, leading to its introduction in Germany. Fortunately, the FDA prevented it from hitting the United States markets. In other cases, however, we may not ever be able to rule out our own government trying to use subliminal messaging to influence us. After all, how would we ever really know? And with that, we thank you for joining us as we examine experiments from Fallout's pre-war era. Are there any experiments we missed that you'd like us to cover? Let us know in the comments. For more weekly Fallout content, follow our Exploring the Wasteland playlist linked here, and a suggested video that you may also like if you enjoyed this one. As always, Wastelanders, keep on dissecting. Thank you for watching. This is Mark signing off.